Hi, I'm Koxing Tang from Curtin University. Welcome to my presentation today on Discourse Patterns and Strategies in Science Classrooms, a synthesis of science classroom discourse frameworks. This presentation is actually based on a forthcoming book that will be published by Routledge in the Teaching and Learning of Science series. The title of this book is called Discourse Strategies for Science Teaching and Learning. This book provides an overview of classroom discourse as well as introduce a number of practical discourse strategies that are useful for both researchers and teachers. In this presentation, I will provide a brief summary of this book and its central framework and argument. Let me start by defining what are discourse patterns and discourse strategies. First, I define discourse as a social pattern in the use of language that shapes and is shaped by the way we think, act, and make meanings. There are three parts in this definition as I highlighted here. The first part is that discourse captures the social cultural practices of a community, and these practices are manifested as characteristics and recognizable patterns of using language in certain ways. The second part is this phrase, shapes and is shaped by, and this captures the mutually constitutive relationship between a big D discourse as a macro phenomena and a small d discourse as recurring instance of using language. The third part is the connection between language and thought, which is mostly based on Vygotsky's work, and this explains the phrase here with the way we think, act, and make meaning. As for discourse strategies, I use the definition from Gibbs as the methods of using discourse to achieve certain goals in an interaction. We use discourse strategies all the time when we engage in the conversation. They can range from something as simple as opening and closing a dialogue to more subtle techniques that we use in, for example, bargaining or interviewing. For teachers, we actually use a lot of discourse strategies whether or not we know it. One of the key arguments in my book is that discourse strategies can be used unconsciously, and I call them implicit strategies. Or they can be more consciously used and enacted deliberately, and I call them explicit strategies. Just to show an example of a discourse pattern, this is the most common discourse pattern that most researchers know about, called the IRE interaction pattern. So in this pattern, you have the teacher first asking a question, and this is called the initiate move. So in this pattern, and after this pattern, a student answers that question, and that's the response. And then the teacher evaluates that response and thus complete this three-part dialogue, or what Lemke calls a triadic dialogue. And this IRE pattern repeats several times until the teacher exhausts all the questions. This IRE pattern reflects a social pattern in a typical classroom conversation based on the speaker's mutual roles and expectations, their power relationship, and their views towards a shared knowledge. This IRE pattern is closely related to a teacher's questioning technique, which is really a kind of discourse strategy. Now, many teachers are not conscious about this discourse strategy, and this is perhaps why they often ask questions that will result in an IRE interaction pattern. And we know that the IRE pattern is not particularly good in promoting student thinking and deep learning. However, if you understand this pattern, you can make a small change in one of the moves and create a different pattern. And this will lead to an IRF-RF interaction pattern as documented by Mortimer and Scott. So if you look at this transcript over here, you can see that the first two utterances and the moves are exactly the same. In the first move, the teacher asks, what is the reason for a solid not being able to conduct electricity? And then the students replied, no free moving electrons. But in the third move, if you compare with the earlier, instead of just evaluating right or wrong, the teacher did a follow-up with that response. And in this case, he asked the students, how do you know that? Which will prompt the students' reasoning and source of evidence. Such follow-up moves are able to generate a more dialogic chain of conversation compared to the IRE pattern. So this example shows the interconnected relationship between between discourse pattern and discourse strategy. Thus, understanding and changing a discourse pattern can help us develop and enact a better discourse strategy. Okay, the interaction pattern that we just saw earlier is just one of several other discourse patterns in a science classroom. In my book, I put together 5 other discourse patterns that we can analyze and subsequently develop effective discourse strategies from them. Each of these patterns deal with one aspect of science classroom practice. So the interaction pattern that we just saw earlier allowed us to look at class or group discussion, discursive mood, participation structure, and power relation. The second discourse pattern is a thematic pattern which helps us look at science content or concept in terms of semantic relationship and ideational meaning. The third pattern is narrative patterns, which deals with ideological stance, framing, and meta-discourse. Then there is also the genre pattern, which examines scientific practices such as explanation, argument, and the use of meta-language. The last 2 discourse patterns, multimodal translation and integration, expand the focus of discourse from a verbal mode to the use of multiple representations, transformations of representations, teaching sequences, multimodal representations, gestures, and embodiment. So this table really represents the main conceptual framework of my book, and every chapter in the book focuses on one of these discourse patterns and its corresponding discourse strategies. I will now talk about each of these discourse patterns. So earlier I've shown an example of an interaction pattern from this transcript. Interaction patterns only looks at the conversational exchange between or among the speakers. However, while this interaction is taking place, there is also a content that is being developed at the same time. To examine this content development, this is where we need to look at a thematic pattern. Now, thematic pattern is an idea introduced from Lemke's book, Talking Science. He defines it as a pattern of semantic relationships among the words that are used to describe a thematic content. So, for example, from this 6 lines of transcript, this is a thematic pattern that was developed by the teacher and the 2 students through that question and answer interaction. As we can see from this thematic pattern, there is a web of semantic relationships among these keywords. The third pattern is the narrative discourse pattern. This is a pattern of how the scientific story is narrated by the teacher from 2 perspectives. The first perspective is how classroom events across time and space are linked, joined together, and this is achieved through the use of organizational meta-discourse. The second aspect is how the authors, and which can be a teacher or scientist, how their affective and ideological stance towards the scientific story is subtly conveyed through the use of evaluative meta-discourse. Now, these 2 narrative aspects of a scientific story are seldom communicated directly, but they are always indirectly conveyed through the use of meta-discourse. And meta-discourse, or another word for it is meta-talk, is a kind of talk about the talk itself. Here are 2 examples that I hope may illustrate what is meta-discourse and narrative pattern. In this transcript, we have a teacher going to explain the pressure of a gas using the kinetic model of matter. In this 6 lines of text, the teacher is not building the content for the explanation. Instead, he is setting up the context for a later conversation where he and the students will be constructing the explanation. In other words, he is framing the narrative for how that later explanation should be interpreted and developed according to certain standards. So how is this narrative being framed? Here I've marked out a number of organizational meta-discourse in blue and evaluative meta-discourse in red. For example, the teacher used a lot of pronouns such as we to signal the activity they are doing together. Like, how do we? Let's try to phrase it together. We have, we will start, let's start, and we have, and so on. So these are organizational meta-discourse that connect the talk to the ongoing activities they were doing together, as well as an external activity of doing the examination, as seen from this verse over here, when the teacher said, let's say this is a 4 marks exam question. In the last line, the teacher talked about the important keywords that you need to make use of. This is a kind of evaluative meta discourse called attitude marker, which signals how we feel about the content matter. And the attitude here, at least from the teacher's stance, is about importance. So it is important from the teacher that the students must phrase these explanations according to several standardized keywords. So this narration conveys a very authoritative and exam-oriented ideological stance on narration of the scientific story. Now let's look at a different example coming from the same teacher. Now in this transcript, the teacher is again framing the context for a later activity. However, this activity is not an explanation from an examination question, but instead it is a hands-on demonstration to show the effect of height on water pressure. In this demonstration, the teacher created 3 holes in a water bottle, and he called them point A, point B, and point C. He then asked the students which point has the highest pressure. The next line over here is interesting because here the teacher set up the criteria for judging the experimental result, which is based on whichever point can shoot the furthest. This is an example of an epistemological marker which establishes the evidential basis of our claim. And in this case, the evidence is based on the sensory experience, which is a kind of seeing is believing. Now, a few lines below, the teacher said, "It is cool, isn't it?" And this is another attitude marker, but instead of signaling importance, like in the first example, this attitude markers signals an affective feeling towards the content that they will be engaging. So overall, the meta discourse in the second transcript conveys a very different narrative pattern compared to the first example. Right, moving on to the fourth pattern, which is genre pattern. According to Fairclough, a genre is a set of conventions associated with and partly realize the way people carry out their practices with language in a community. In science, there are 4 major genres, which are explanation, argument, experimental report, and information report. From a discourse perspective, scientific genres are closely related to scientific practices. Let's use the same example from the earlier to show the genre pattern of a scientific explanation in classroom talk. This is the example about explanation for the pressure of a gas. Now, from previous studies, I've identified the genre structure of a scientific explanation as consisting of 3 parts. The first part is a premise, which is a statement held to be true that does not need to be explained in the context of that explanation. A premise also provides a first cause for an explanation. The second part is a reasoning, which is a chain of sequences that deductively links the premise to the outcome. And the outcome is simply the natural phenomenon to be explained. Okay, if you look at this transcript here, you can see that how different statements in this transcript corresponds to different parts of the genre structure. However, you will notice that the genre structure is very implicit in that the teacher never actually communicates to the students what is exactly the structure of an explanation. Neither does he also communicate what is required from the students how to construct this explanation. So one of the things I've done in my study is to develop an explicit discourse strategy called PRO based on this genre pattern. So basically in that study, the students learn the meta-language of premise, reasoning, and outcome, and they then apply this meta-language as they construct scientific explanation. So this is an example of an explicit discourse strategy. Alright, I need to quickly run through the last 2 discourse patterns as I'm running short of time. In my earlier examples on the demonstration of the water pressure, you might have noticed that the verbal utterance alone is not sufficient for us to understand what is going on. So discourse pattern is not limited to verbal utterance alone, but we also need to look at the non-verbal actions, such as the non-verbal actions in this transcript. And we need to examine the multimodal patterns. There are two kinds of multimodal patterns. The first one is a multimodal, what I call a multimodal translation pattern, which is a pattern of translating from one mode to another mode, such as, for example, the mode of this water bottle, which is a physical mode that the teacher is using to demonstrate the water pressure, and translating it to the visual mode of the drawing that he has drawn over here. The second multimodal pattern is what I call a multimodal integration pattern. This is a pattern of coordinating and combining the meanings from the various modes at any point in time. So for example, if you look at this last line over here, when the teacher is making this statement, he is also at the same time using gestures to point at a certain part of his diagram. So multimodal integration patterns looks at how meanings are combined and made when these different modes, the verbal, the visual, and the gestural, are put together. But I provide a brief mention of the 6 discourse patterns, and in summary, they are interaction, thematic, narrative, genre, multimodal translation, and multimodal integration patterns. Earlier, I have also mentioned that for every discourse patterns, we can think about some discourse strategies that can enhance the discourse patterns. So in my book, I've introduced a number of discourse strategies that can enhance the discourse patterns. And some of these strategies were developed from my research projects, but many of them were also adapted and inspired from other researchers, and I included their references in this slide. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to present all these discourse strategies, so you may just have to get my book to learn more about them. All right, to sum up, let me reiterate that understanding a discourse pattern is important because it allowed us to develop and enact more explicit discourse strategies that can enhance classroom discourse. In my presentation, I have also briefly talked about my framework of classroom discourse, which consists of identifying the interaction, thematic, narrative, genre, and multimodal patterns from classroom transcripts. I believe this framework covers most of the discourse practices we will find in the science classroom. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching. And here are the references that I've used in my presentation. And here is my contact if you like to contact me for more information. So thank you very much.